With Tobey Maguire's Spider-Man, along with a slew of other characters from the classic early 2000s Spider-Man trilogy, such as Alfred Molina's Doc Ock and William Dafoe's Green Goblin likely showing up in No Way Home, we thought now was a good time to revisit the trilogy that first brought us Spidey to the big screen, and 25 things you may have missed. This includes references to other Marvel and even DC characters subtly hidden in the movies, cool pieces of trivia and behind-the-scenes stories, and some familiar cameos you might have forgotten about. Let's take a look. Now, there are many comic book Easter eggs in the original trilogy, most of them relating to Marvel, and in particular Spider-Man, but we wanted to start off with a reference to Marvel's main rival, DC. Now, you would likely have caught this one if you were a comic book fan, but while Peter tries to get his organic web slinging to work, which everyone loves, right? He tries out a number of different catchphrases. Two of these catchphrases are gags at DC's expense, with Up and Away Web being a Superman reference, and Shazam being well, you can guess what that's a reference to. But as we said, most of the Easter eggs in the series are Marvel references, with some less known than others. An example of this is the reference to a Marvel character named Stingray. For those who don't know, Dr. Walter Newell, aka Stingray, was created in the 60s and is an expert oceanographer and engineer who designed a unique suit for deep sea exploration, basing the look on manta rays, and has ended up working alongside Namor a bunch of times. How does he relate to the Spider-Man trilogy though? Well, while designing potential costume ideas, Peter sketches one that happens to look a lot like Stingray's suit. Sorry Spidey, that one's already taken. Now, as you know, Spider-Man 3, along with Tobey Maguire's amazing dance skills, has a ton of different villains, and arguably too many. However, while Venom and Sandman had to wait till the third movie to finally appear, one of them was actually briefly referenced in the first movie. During the moment J Jonah Jameson is introduced, he does what he does best and rants about how Spider-Man is a menace to society and is ultimately frustrated that no one can get a photograph of the feckless, treacherous, unhinged menace. Jameson's words, not mine. In the scene, one of Jameson's underlings says the line, "Eddie's been trying to get a picture of him for weeks," which of course is a reference to Eddie Brock, who, as you know, later becomes Venom. If there's one thing Marvel love, it's alliteration. You know, like Peter Parker, J Jonah Jameson, Green Goblin, Matt Murdock, Bucky Barnes, Doctor Doom, Reed Richards, and my personal favorite, Fang Foom, just to name a few. But anyway, that's just a cheap segue to get to my actual point. There is a Fang Foom Easter egg in the trilogy. Well, maybe. In Norman Osborn's residence, we can see a weird green mask, which looks like it could potentially be a reference to the dragon's head, although it's an albeit weird reference. Keeping on with the references to Marvel characters, in the scene where Peter picks up some flowers while on his way to MJ's play, we can see two types of flowers with the cards carnations and snapdragons above them. These were apparently particularly chosen by Raimi because they were a reference to two different villains, Snapdragon and Carnage, which is pretty cool seeing as the latter is set to appear in the Venom sequel. While the Carnage Carnation one might be seen as, you know, a little bit of a stretch, you've got to say the Snapdragon one is a pretty great Easter egg. One character that's easy to forget was in the original trilogy was Dr. Kirk Connors, who is better known as his alter ego, Lizard. Although he never got to go into his reptilian form in the original trilogy and had to wait till The Amazing Spider-Man with Andrew Garfield. And if the theories are to be believed, No Way Home. But that doesn't mean his alter ego isn't at least referenced in Spider-Man 3. As Connors calls Peter to tell him of his parasite's influence and the ramifications, if you look closely in the background, you'll be able to see the skeleton of, you guessed it, a lizard. Speaking of No Way Home though, while Lizard and others on this list are rumored to be playing a role in the movie, one character that will be playing a prominent part in the film is Doctor Strange, unless of course he's Mephisto. However, his connection to Spidey runs deeper than just the MCU, and although he didn't appear in the original trilogy, he did at least get a shout out. In Spider-Man 2, as Jameson and co. are debating on what alias to give Otto Octavius, they nearly land on another Doctor title, with the name Doctor Strange touted, until of course they remember it's already taken by a certain neurosurgeon. It's no secret that Stan Lee cameos in basically every Marvel movie, and the original trilogy is no different, but Lee isn't the only important Marvel name to get a mention in the series. Steve Ditko was another man alongside Lee and Jack Kirby that played a huge part in Marvel being a success, and his ties to Spider-Man are particularly strong, so it's no wonder Raimi paid tribute to the legend in his films. In Spider-Man 2, Peter's relentless landlord, who has been eternalized in meme form, is called Mr. Dickovich, which, well, giving your name to a grumpy landlord who is always looking for rent may not sound like the best tribute, but we think it's pretty nice. Now, to be honest, you probably already caught this one, but we wanted to mention it just in case. As Peter waits for MJ at the theater, he comes across a woman playing a familiar song on the violin, with it clearly being the tune of the classic 1960s Spider-Man theme, which now I bet is firmly stuck in your head, isn't it? Honestly, how can it not be? Darn it. As you know, Harry Osborn steps into his father's shoes as the Green Goblin, and he is shown continuing his father's legacy through a montage in the third film. However, it's alluded that he nearly became a very different villain during this montage. Hobgoblin. Okay, not really a very different villain, seeing as Hobgoblin is a supervillain copycat of Green Goblin. But during the montage, we see a silver version of the Goblin mask, which is more than likely a reference to Hobgoblin. Throughout the trilogy, Raimi makes more subtle, hilarious puns pertaining to spiders and arachnids in general, with the inclusion of an Alfa Romeo spider, an advert for pest control, and the copious amounts of spider-themed headlines in the Daily Bugle. But one that mostly went unnoticed is the reference to Lucio Fulci's 1981 movie The Beyond, where a man is bitten to death by arachnids. As Peter transforms into his spider self, a silhouette of a spider can be seen flashing on screen, and it was a shot taken directly by Raimi from The Beyond. This one goes out to all the comic book fans out there, which I assume is most of you given the subject matter, but if you're a big Spidey fan, you will most likely be familiar with the Easter egg in Spider-Man 3 in the Belltower. In the scene, Peter removes the symbiote within a church bell tower, with Eddie Brock down below, and the scene is pretty much taken straight out of the comics. It is an iconic moment in the comics, and the imagery is so memorable that the scene in the movie is almost a complete recreation of that moment. Sometimes companies pay bucket loads of cash to advertise in a movie, especially a big budget Marvel one. I mean, take a look at the opening of Far From Home, for example. That's literally just an Audi commercial. Or the moment Bond drives a Ford in the Bahamas in Casino Royale. Or all the Heineken bottles in Skyfall. Or just Bond movies in general, really. But anyway, I'm getting really off topic here. In Spider-Man 2, one company got to advertise for free. Joe's Pizzeria, that Peter Parker works for as a delivery boy, is actually a real pizza joint in Greenwich Village. And if you were to call the number on Peter's helmet, you would indeed get through to Joe's Pizza, and could order yourself a hot slice of pie, which we'd recommend, seeing as they are apparently known as one of the best pizza places in New York City. So yeah, give them a call. If you want to buy pizza, please don't call them just to spam them. Unless you want spam on your pizza, never mind. While Flash Thompson is one of the more prominent characters in the MCU Spider-Man series, with him being played by the Grand Budapest actor Tony Revolori, he was also in the Raimi series, and was played by none other than Deathstroke Joe Manganiello, and you would be forgiven for forgetting that because he looks wildly different. Flash appeared in the first Spider-Man where he liked to pick on Peter until he got his butt kicked, but he actually made a return in the third movie with him appearing at Harry's funeral, suggesting that maybe he turned a corner in his life and is actually alright now. Maybe getting his butt kicked by Peter was a good thing. Now, if you're a horror nerd, or a herd as I like to say, you will probably know this one already, but again, I figured I'd put it in here anyway. We're referring to the multiple cameos of Bruce Campbell, who has worked with Sam Raimi on multiple occasions and is good friends with the director. Campbell appears in all three movies, with him being the ring announcer in the first film, a theater usher in the second one, and a French maitre d' in the third. Here's a further piece of Bruce Campbell related trivia for you. You may also recognize his voice from the Spider-Man video games, with Campbell announcing all the tutorial levels. While the VFX in the series may look a little dated now, at the time they were pretty groundbreaking, and 8-year-old me had my mind blown by how cool it looked. Raimi also appreciated how good the movies looked, and wanted to pay tribute to the special effects director John Fraser in the series. In Spider-Man 2, while MJ waits for her boyfriend, you can see on a poster in the background saying J. Fraser is especially effective, which is a little homage to the Oscar-winning VFX guru. Say what you want about Spider-Man 3, one positive we have to give it is it remembers where it came from, and the movies that came before it. An example of this are the pictures that can be seen on Peter's desk in the apartment. The reason for this is that if you look closely, you will notice that the pictures are the very same ones Peter took during the laboratory visit. You know, the one that turned him into Spider-Man in the very first movie. It's a nice touch and reminded us how far their relationship had come. Like the Belltower scene in Spider-Man 3, the moment Green Goblin drops MJ while making Peter choose between the woman he loves gloves and a load of school children is taken from the comics, although there are a couple alterations. The main one being that in the comics, it's actually Gwen Stacy that took the plunge, and she died as a result of being caught in the crossfire. When David Fincher was attached to the project, he planned on having Gwen Stacy in the movie and having her die in this scene, but Raimi changed this, sparing both MJ and the children, but keeping the moment Goblin is impaled by his own glider. Continuing on with the direct references to the comic books, the scene where Peter enters a wrestling competition so he can win some cash, but instead ends up getting Uncle Ben killed unintentionally, is taken from the comics. Amazing Fantasy number 15, Spider-Man ends up in a wrestling competition before the death of his beloved uncle, and it is also where the "with great power comes great responsibility" moment came from. Now, I know what you're gonna say here, and I know we've covered this a few times on this channel already, so it's not likely to be something you missed, but just on the off chance that you didn't know this one by now, the lunch tray scene where Peter catches everything in one go was done for real. This meant the scene was done without the use of VFX, but instead an adhesive to make sure everything stayed in place. But the scene wasn't easy, with it taking Maguire 156 takes to get it right. But you have to say, the end result is pretty awesome. Another scene that was difficult to shoot was the very famous and iconic upside down kiss in the rain, which has been recreated in parody on multiple occasions. Apparently though, it was a bit of a nightmare to actually pull off, with it taking numerous takes and water had to be constantly removed from Maguire's nose as he kept flooding. As we said earlier, everyone loved the organic web shooters, right? No? They didn't? Oh, well, I'm gonna be honest with you here. I actually kinda like them. I mean, I know it's disgusting and anatomically incorrect, but I like it. And I know that's an unpopular opinion, but there you go. Anyway, the idea for the organic web shooters actually wasn't Raimi's, and was the brainchild of another director attached to the project, James Cameron. Cameron's Spider-Man movie was massively different, and would have starred Leonardo DiCaprio as Peter Parker, and would have had a darker vibe than Raimi's trilogy, but it ended up being scrapped. Other directors who were linked with the movie were Ang Lee, M. Night Shyamalan, Roland Emmerich, and as we mentioned, David Fincher. Speaking of the Cameron version though, while Sandman did show up in Spider-Man 3 and Electro in The Amazing Spider-Man 2, they were very nearly the main villains in Spider-Man before Green Goblin, with them being attached to be the primary villains, but both ended up hitting the cutting room floor. Speaking of Green Goblin though, while William Dafoe crushed it as Norman Osborn, it's hard to imagine any other actors playing the role. There were a whole host of nearly goblins. The considered actors included Bill Paxton, Mel Gibson, Charlie Sheen, John Travolta, John Malkovich, and the one and only Nicolas Cage. Other than Bruce Campbell, there are a number of cameos that appear in the series. Some of them you might have known, some of them you might have forgotten, and others you might have missed entirely. They include Lucy Lawless, Elizabeth Banks, Randy Savage, Octavia Spencer, Stan Lee, obviously, and even Tobey Maguire's younger half-brothers, who are the kids on the train that sees Peter's face and tell him they won't tell nobody. While we have been pretty complimentary of the trilogy, because we do genuinely love it, we do have to poke fun at it slightly. That is because it pulls off somewhat of a VFX/continuity goof. As Peter swings away from Times Square with Mary Jane in his arms, and Kirsten Dunst cleans onto what is clearly a mannequin, he is shown swinging from left to right, while Mary Jane's hair blows back from her face as if he was swinging from right to left. Yes, it's trivial, and yes, it doesn't mean anything in the grand scheme of things, but we thought we'd throw it in there. As I have a little bit of time here, I thought I'd just throw in a few more things. While there were some liberties taken by the filmmakers in the trilogy, with alterations being made from the typical comic book locations, such as Oscorp changing from a skyscraper to a smoky factory, and new names and places created just for the movie alone, there is one that does stay true to the comics: Midtown High. In both the comics and the MCU, Midtown High is the place that Peter Parker spent high school years, and Raimi, staying true to the comics, made sure that the school Peter attends in the first Spider-Man was also Midtown High. And also another quick piece of trivia, after the first Spider-Man, Tobey Maguire ended up injuring his back on the set of Seabiscuit, and was almost unable to return to the role of Peter Parker for Spider-Man 2. So, Sony began negotiations with Jake Gyllenhaal and had him lined up as Maguire's replacement. But thankfully for Maguire, he managed to heal in time and ended up keeping his role, leaving Gyllenhaal to wait till Far From Home to be in a Spider-Man movie. And finally, you probably caught this one, but I always like to appreciate a good bit of wordplay. After being bitten by a spider, Peter returns home and makes his way up to the bed, saying he feels sick. As he goes up the stairs, Aunt May asks if he wants a bite, and he tells her, "No thanks, had a bite."